The fluorescent lights above my workstation hummed with that particular frequency that always gave me a headache after the 8th hour, and I was well past that now, somewhere around hour 11 of what was supposed to be a 6-hour shift. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine clung to everything in the restoration studio, mixing with the musty scent of canvas that had survived centuries only to end up under my careful but exhausted hands. I held my phone between my shoulder and ear, both hands still working on the delicate surface of an 18th century portrait, speaking in the language that felt like home, even though home was an ocean away. Tak, babo, I know. I promise I will send the money next week, I said softly in Ukrainian, my grandmother's worried voice crackling through the connection from Kiev. The painting in front of me was worth more than I would earn in 5 years, maybe 10, and yet here I was in my paint-stained jeans and oversized sweater that had seen better days, trying to explain to the woman who raised me why this month's payment would be late again. My boss had been impossible lately, demanding I work on 3 major projects simultaneously, and the overtime pay he had promised kept getting pushed back, always next month, always soon, always just out of reach like everything else in my life since I had come to New York on a work visa that felt more like a countdown timer to inevitable deportation. I am so tired, Babo, I continued, switching the phone to my other ear as I reached for a finer brush, the kind that cost $60, and that I had to sign out from supplies like it was made of gold. But I am fine, really. Do not worry about me. Just make sure you are taking your medicine and staying warm, okay? The studio was quiet except for my voice and the distant murmur of something happening in the museum's west wing. Some kind of event I had not paid attention to, because events meant crowds, and crowds meant I had to stay hidden in my corner of the building where people forgot I existed until they needed a miracle worked on a canvas that should have been treated better a century ago. My grandmother was telling me about her neighbor's cat, the one that kept getting into her small garden, and I smiled despite my exhaustion, because this was the kind of normal problem I wished I had, instead of the constant anxiety about money and visas, and whether I would still have a job next month if I pushed back even once against my boss's unreasonable demands. The painting I was working on was a minor work by a major artist, important enough to require careful attention, but not important enough to get the budget it deserved, which seemed to be the story of my entire professional life, always working on things that mattered, but never quite mattering enough myself. I love you, Babo, I said quietly, feeling the familiar ache in my chest that came every time we talked. Every time I was reminded that she was aging and alone and I was here, in this cold city that never slept but never really noticed me either. I will call you on Sunday, same time, yes? Take care of yourself, please. I ended the call and set the phone down on my cluttered workstation, closing my eyes for just a moment and letting myself feel the weight of everything, the exhaustion that went bone deep, the homesickness that never quite left, the fear that I was failing at everything I had come here to accomplish. When I opened my eyes and turned to reach for the solvent I needed, my heart stopped. There was a man standing in the doorway of the studio, perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness, and something that felt dangerously close to fear. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair styled in that effortlessly perfect way that screamed expensive barber, and he wore a suit that I knew without knowing anything about men's fashion cost more than several months of my rent. But it was his eyes that held me frozen, pale gray like winter ice, and they were fixed on me with a focus that made me feel simultaneously seen and examined, like I was another painting he was considering acquiring. "Your accent," he said, and his voice was low and rich, and carried just the faintest trace of something Slavic underneath the perfect English. "You are from Lviv?" He had spoken in Ukrainian, flawless Ukrainian, and the shock of hearing my language from this stranger's mouth in this place at this hour made my thoughts scatter like startled birds. I switched to English immediately, defensively, trying to reclaim some sense of control even though my hands were shaking slightly as I set down my brush. "This is a restricted area," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "The fundraiser is in the West Wing." He did not move from the doorway, did not apologize or look embarrassed at being caught somewhere he should not be, and that stillness of his was somehow more threatening than if he had advanced toward me. "You just became very interesting, miss," he said, switching to English as well, though his slight Russian accent wrapped around the words, in a way that made them sound like a caress and a threat all at once. I stood up from my stool, acutely aware of how I must look compared to him, paint under my fingernails, hair pulled back in a messy knot, wearing clothes I had owned since graduate school. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound authoritative, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Now." He smiled then, just a slight curve of his mouth that did not reach those unsettling gray eyes, and he took one step into the studio, just one, but it felt like the space between us had collapsed entirely. "I do not take orders," he said quietly, his gaze moving from my face to the paintings surrounding us, to the tools of my trade scattered across the work surface, then back to me with renewed focus. "But I do appreciate beauty when I find it, whether in art or something far more rare." The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, or maybe that was just my vision swimming, because I could not quite catch my breath properly. And I realized with a start that I was alone in this part of the museum with a man who radiated danger like other people radiated warmth. "Who are you?" I asked, and I hated that my voice wavered slightly on the question. "What do you want?" He moved further into the studio, and I noticed how he moved with a predator's grace, each step deliberate and controlled, and he stopped beside the painting I had been working on, studying it with what seemed like genuine interest. "My name is Dmitry Volkov," he said, not looking at me but at the canvas, "and I am attending the fundraiser in the West Wing." But their conversation became tedious, and I needed air, needed a moment away from people who talk too much and say too little. The name meant nothing to me, should it have meant something, and I watched as he leaned closer to examine my restoration work, his expensive cologne mixing with the studio smells of oil and solvent. "You are very skilled," he observed, his finger hovering just above the surface without touching, which told me he knew something about art conservation even if everything else about him screamed danger. "This is delicate work, requires patience and a steady hand." I did not know what to say to that. Did not know how to navigate this surreal conversation with this dangerous, beautiful stranger who had somehow wandered into my workspace and overheard me speaking Ukrainian to my grandmother about money troubles and exhaustion. "How long were you standing there?" I asked instead. And the question came out almost like an accusation. "Long enough," he said, finally turning those ice-gray eyes back to me, and there was something in his expression that I could not read, something that looked almost like longing but harder, sharper. "Long enough to hear you speak the language my mother used to speak to me when I was a child, before she died, before I forgot what it sounded like to hear Ukrainian spoken with love instead of fear." The admission was so unexpected, so raw despite the careful control in his voice, that I did not know how to respond, and we stood there in the harsh fluorescent light surrounded by paintings that had survived wars and revolutions and the simple passage of time, while something shifted in the air between us, something I did not want to name or acknowledge. "I should not have listened," he continued, but his tone suggested he was not actually sorry. "I should have announced myself, but your voice, the way you spoke to your grandmother, it reminded me of something I thought I had lost." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the studio's stuffy warmth, and I wished I had not answered my grandmother's call, wished I had not stayed late, wished I was anywhere but here, under the scrutiny of this man who looked at me like I was a puzzle he intended to solve whether I wanted to be solved or not. "I need to get back to work," I said, gesturing vaguely at the painting, at the tools, at anything that might break this strange spell. "And you need to return to your fundraiser." Dmitry Volkov did not move, and the smile that had been playing at his mouth faded into something more serious, more intent. "What is your name?" he asked. And it was not really a question despite the phrasing, it was a demand wrapped in courtesy. "Marina," I said before I could think better of it, before I could lie or deflect, and I cursed myself for the automatic honesty. "Marina Kovalenko." He repeated my name slowly, like he was tasting it, testing how it felt in his mouth, and something about hearing my full name in his accent made my stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a kind of awareness I absolutely could not afford. Marina Kovalenko from Lviv, working late in a museum restoration studio, sending money home to her grandmother, tired but still careful with her work. Still gentle when speaking to family, still strong enough to tell a stranger to leave, even when she is clearly frightened. He had listened to more than I realized, had gleaned more from my brief phone conversation than should have been possible. And the fact that he was laying it all out now felt like a power play, like he was showing me exactly how much he had already learned in the space of a few minutes. I took a step back instinctively and my hip hit the edge of the work table, sending a jar of brushes rattling. "I am not frightened," I lied, lifting my chin in what I hoped looked like defiance rather than bravado covering terror. "Good," he said, and he finally moved toward the door, giving me space to breathe again. "Fear is useful only when it keeps you alive, but I have no intention of harming you, Marina Kovalenko." He paused in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the corridor lights, and he looked back at me one more time with those winter eyes that seemed to see straight through all my carefully constructed walls. "I will see you again," he said, and it was not a question or a hope, it was a simple statement of fact, a promise or a threat, or maybe both. "And next time, perhaps you will tell me more about Lviv, about your grandmother, about what brought you here to this city that does not deserve someone who still speaks her mother tongue with such tenderness." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor, fading into the distant sound of the fundraiser's string quartet and polite conversation, leaving me alone in my studio with my racing heart and the lingering scent of his cologne, and the terrible certainty that everything had just changed in ways I could not yet understand, but would definitely come to regret. I spent the entire night, after Dmitry Volkov left my studio, trying to convince myself that the encounter meant nothing, that he was just another wealthy patron who had wandered into the wrong part of the museum and would forget about me by morning, but my hands shook every time I picked up a brush and I kept hearing his voice saying my name, like he already owned it. I went home at 3 in the morning, took a scalding shower that did nothing to wash away the feeling of being seen too clearly, and fell into bed for what felt like minutes before my alarm dragged me back to consciousness and the reality of another day, restoring other people's treasures while my own life slowly fell apart. The call from the museum director's office came at 9:15, just as I was setting up my workspace, and the assistant's voice on the phone had that tight professional quality that meant something had gone very wrong, and somehow it was going to become my problem. "Miss Kovalenko, you need to come to Director Chen's office immediately," she said, and there was no room in her tone for questions or delays. My stomach dropped, because in 2 years of working at the Hartley Museum, I had never been summoned to the director's office, had barely exchanged more than pleasantries with the woman who ran the institution, and I knew with the certainty of someone whose immigration status was always precarious that this could not be good news. When I walked into the spacious corner office with its view of Central Park and its carefully curated collection of pre-Columbian art, Director Chen was standing beside her desk with 2 people in dark suits who had federal agent written all over them, and my mouth went dry. "Miss Kovalenko," Director Chen said, and her usually warm expression was replaced with something careful and distant. "These are Special Agents Morrison and Chen, no relation. From the FBI, they need to ask you some questions about the Repin painting you were working on." The older agent, Morrison, had gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much, and he gestured to a chair with the kind of false courtesy that made it clear sitting was not actually optional. "Miss Kovalenko, when did you last see the painting?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook. Last night, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. I was working on it until almost 3 in the morning. It was on my restoration table when I left. And you locked the studio? The younger Agent Chen asked. She was probably only a few years older than me, but she had the kind of assurance that came from carrying a badge and a gun. I nodded, then realized they might need a verbal answer. Yes, I always lock the studio. The paintings are valuable, and the security protocols are very strict. Morrison exchanged a glance with his partner that I could not interpret. The painting is missing, he said flatly. Stolen sometime between when you left at 3 a.m. and when the morning security sweep was conducted at 6. The cameras in your wing were disabled from 2:45 to 4:30. My heart stopped, actually stopped, and then started again with painful thuds that I could feel in my throat. I do not understand, I said, looking from the agents to Director Chen, who would not meet my eyes. Are you saying someone thinks I took it? We are saying you were the last person to see it, Morrison continued, his tone neutral but his gaze sharp. And you had access and opportunity, so yes, we need to understand your movements last night, who you spoke to, whether you noticed anything unusual. I told them everything I could remember, about working late, about being tired, about the phone call with my grandmother. But I did not mention Dmitry Volkov, because some instinct I did not want to examine told me that bringing him into this would make everything infinitely worse. The questions went on for an hour, the same things asked different ways, and I could feel my precarious position in this country becoming more precarious with every repetition, could imagine my visa application being flagged, my background checked more thoroughly, my entire life here unraveling because someone had stolen a painting while I was too exhausted to notice. When they finally let me go with instructions not to leave the city and to make myself available for further questioning, I walked back to my studio on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and found the space sealed off with yellow tape, my tools and projects inaccessible, my work effectively halted. I was suspended pending the investigation, Director Chen informed me later via email, with pay for now, but that could change depending on what the FBI discovered, and I sat in the museum's staff break room staring at my phone and trying to figure out how I was going to pay my rent and send money to my grandmother and keep my visa status clean when everything was falling apart. The subway ride back to Brooklyn felt longer than usual, every stop a small eternity, and I kept replaying the FBI agent's questions in my head, trying to figure out if I had said something wrong, if I had somehow incriminated myself without meaning to. My apartment building was a 5-story walk-up in a neighborhood that was gentrifying in that uneven way that meant expensive coffee shops next to bodegas with bulletproof glass. And I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, with my bag of personal items from my studio locker feeling heavier with each step. I could hear music coming from inside the apartment before I even got my key in the lock, some pop song that my roommate Jessica loved, and I was already rehearsing how I was going to tell her that I might not be able to make rent this month when I opened the door and saw him. Dmitry Volkov was sitting on our sagging couch like he belonged there, perfectly at ease in his dark suit that probably cost more than all our furniture combined, and Jessica was in the kitchen area making tea and chattering about something I could not process, because my brain had short-circuited at the impossibility of this scene. "Marina," Jessica called out when she saw me, "your boyfriend is here. He brought flowers. Isn't that sweet? Why didn't you tell me you were seeing someone?" The words made no sense, each one landing like a separate blow, and I looked from Jessica's oblivious smile to Dimitri's calm expression to the enormous bouquet of white roses on our scratched kitchen counter. Too many roses, too expensive, too everything. "How did you get in here?" I said, my voice coming out flat and dangerous, and Jessica's smile faltered. "He knocked, and I answered," she said, sounding confused. "He said he was your boyfriend and he had flowers, and I thought, you know, it was sweet and you never bring anyone home, so I just assumed." "I am calling the police," I said, dropping my bag and pulling out my phone, my hands shaking with a fury that was safer than the fear underneath it. "Jessica, Go to your room. Now. Dmitri stood up smoothly, no sudden movements, and he spoke to Jessica with a warmth that made me want to scream. Thank you for the hospitality, but Marina and I need to talk privately. It is a bit of a misunderstanding. Couples things. You know how it is. Jessica looked between us uncertainly, but she had always been too trusting, too Midwestern nice to recognize danger when it was sitting on our couch, and she retreated to her bedroom with a worried glance back at me. Please do not call the police, Dmitri said once her door clicked shut, his voice still calm, still reasonable. They will ask why a Russian businessman is in your apartment, and your visa situation will become complicated. The threat was delivered so softly, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a moment to fully register it, and when I did, the phone nearly slipped from my shaking hand. You have no right, I said, switching to Ukrainian because I needed the comfort of my own language, needed something that was mine in this violation of my space. You have no right to come into my home, to threaten me, to pretend you know anything about me. He answered in Ukrainian, and his accent was different in our shared language, softer somehow, more real. Your father was a hero, he said quietly, and something in his expression shifted to something that looked almost like respect. My mother was from Kharkiv. She used to tell me stories about men like your father, men who fought for something bigger than themselves, who died for it. We are not enemies, Marina. Then what are we? I demanded, my anger burning hot enough to override my fear. What are we if not enemies? You who come into my home uninvited. You who clearly know things about me that you have no right to know. He gestured to the other chair, the one with the broken spring that we kept meaning to fix. And after a moment I sat, not because he asked, but because my legs were not going to hold me much longer. That depends on whether you help me recover what was stolen, he said, sitting back down on the couch and leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on mine with that same unsettling intensity from the night before. The Rapine painting, the one that was taken from your studio while the cameras were conveniently disabled, it belongs to me. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. The museum owns that painting, I said slowly. It has been in their collection for 15 years. The museum believes they own it, Dmitri corrected. But provenance is complicated, especially for art that moved through so many hands during the Soviet era. And let us say that my family has a stronger claim than their paperwork suggests. He paused, seeming to consider how much to tell me. I own the security company that the museum contracts for their surveillance systems, which is how I know that you did not steal the painting. I have seen the footage from the cameras that were not disabled. I know you left at 3:02 in the morning, and the theft occurred at 3:15. The relief that flooded through me at his words was immediately replaced by suspicion. If you know I did not steal it, why are you here? I asked. Why not just tell the FBI what you know? Because the person who stole it is someone I need to handle personally, he said, and his voice went cold in a way that made me understand exactly what kind of man I was dealing with, and because you are going to help me get it back. I am not helping you with anything, I said, standing up because I needed to feel less trapped, even though I knew the physical distance meant nothing when he had already invaded my privacy so thoroughly. You need to leave, now, before I do call the police and take my chances with the visa situation. Marina Kovalenko, he said, not moving. Born in Lviv 28 years ago. Came to the United States on a student visa 6 years ago for graduate work in art conservation at NYU, transitioned to a work visa sponsored by the Hartley Museum 2 years ago. Said work visa expires in exactly 5 months and 23 days. Sends $800 every month to Valentina Kovalenko in Kyiv. Grandmother and only living relative after your mother Olena died of cancer when you were 16, and your father Andrei was killed in action near Donetsk in 2014 while serving with the Ukrainian armed forces. He recited my life like he was reading from a file, and each detail felt like another invasion, another violation, and I could barely breathe through the rage and fear. "Stop," I said, but he continued, his voice gentler now, almost regretful. "You are barely making rent in this apartment. You share with Jessica Martinez, who works at a veterinary clinic and has no idea that you are constantly one emergency away from financial disaster. You have $17,000 in student loans and $342 in your checking account as of this morning, and you are terrified that the FBI investigation will tank your visa renewal and you will have to go back to Ukraine, where there are no jobs in your field, and your grandmother needs you to keep sending money for her medications." Tears were burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "How do you know all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I make it my business to know things," he said simply, standing up and moving toward me. "And when I was looking into acquiring the museum's security contract, I did a thorough background check on all personnel with access to high-value items, which is how I first learned about you 8 months ago. How I learned that the daughter of Andrei Kovalenko was working as a restoration specialist. How I learned that you were here, alone, struggling, sending money home to support the mother of a man who was a hero." 8 months, I repeated, feeling sick. "You have known about me for 8 months." He nodded, no apology in his expression. "And when I heard you speaking Ukrainian last night, when I saw you working on that specific painting, I knew that fate or chance or whatever you want to call it had put you exactly where I needed you to be." The white roses on the counter seemed to mock me with their beauty, their expense, their wrongness in this space. And I looked at Dmitry Volkov standing in my cramped living room with the radiator clanking and the paint peeling and the late afternoon light coming through windows that had not been properly cleaned in years. And I understood that I had become a piece in a game I did not understand and had never agreed to play. "I do not care about your painting," I said, even though we both knew it was a lie. "I do not care about your business or your security company or whatever complicated criminal thing you are involved in. I just want to keep my job and my visa and my life." He reached into his jacket and I flinched, but he only pulled out a business card, plain white with a single phone number embossed in black. "The painting contains something more valuable than the art itself," he said, holding out the card. "Something that was hidden by people who knew they were running out of time, something that your father knew about, something that I need to recover before it falls into the wrong hands." "My father," I said, taking the card with numb fingers. "What does my father have to do with any of this?" "Everything," Dmitri said softly, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked almost human, almost vulnerable. "Your father and my mother, they were part of something bigger than either of us, and now that legacy has become our burden whether we want it or not." He moved toward the door, and I did not try to stop him, did not know what to say or do or think. "The FBI will clear you of suspicion within 48 hours, he said as he opened the door. "I will make sure of it. But the person who took the painting will not stop there. They will come after anything connected to it, which means they will eventually come after you. The card has my private number. Call it when you are ready to hear the whole truth, or do not call it and take your chances with ignorance, but either way. Marina, you are already involved." He left, closing the door quietly behind him, and I stood there holding his card, with the white roses filling the apartment with their cloying perfume and Jessica's music still playing faintly through her bedroom door, and my entire world tilted on its axis in a way I knew would never quite right itself again. I spent 2 days staring at that business card, moving it from my wallet to my desk, to the kitchen counter and back again, as if changing its location would somehow change what it represented or what calling the number would mean for my life. The FBI came back once more, asked the same questions in slightly different configurations, and then Agent Morrison told me with something that might have been sympathy that they were pursuing other leads and I was free to return to work. The investigation had determined I was not a suspect, and I should have felt relief, but instead, I just felt hollow. Director Chen welcomed me back with the kind of professional warmth that did not quite reach her eyes, and I knew that even though I had been cleared, there would always be a question mark next to my name in her mind. Always a small doubt about whether I could be trusted with the museum's most valuable pieces. My studio felt different when I returned to it, violated somehow, even though everything was exactly where I had left it, except for the empty space on my restoration table where the repin had been. That absence like a missing tooth, I could not stop probing with my tongue. Jessica asked about my boyfriend a few times, confused about why I had been so angry, and I told her it was complicated, and we had broken up, and could we please not talk about it. And she accepted this with the kind of easy American optimism that assumed all problems were temporary and all wounds would heal with enough time and ice cream. The white roses died slowly on our counter, their petals browning at the edges, and I could not bring myself to throw them away even though looking at them made something in my chest ache. On the third night after Dmitri had invaded my apartment, I was working on a different painting, something minor from the museum's storage collection, when my phone rang with an international number I recognized immediately. "Babo," I said, trying to keep my voice light even though my hands were already shaking. "How are you? Is everything okay?" My grandmother's voice came through thin and frightened, and she was speaking so fast in Ukrainian that I had to ask her to slow down, to breathe, to tell me what happened. "Men came to the apartment," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "3 of them. They said they were from the government, but they did not show proper identification. They asked about you, about your father, about what he might have left behind, what legacy he might have passed on. They were not police, Marina. They were something else. Something that made me remember the old days, the bad days, and I told them I knew nothing, but they did not believe me. And they said they would be back, that they would keep coming back until someone told them what they wanted to know." The world tilted sideways and I gripped the edge of my work table to keep from falling, my restoration tools blurring in my vision. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "Did they touch you, Babo? Please tell me you are okay." "I am fine," she insisted, but her voice was shaking. "They did not hurt me. But Marina, I am scared. I do not understand what they want or why they think your father left something behind. He was a soldier. He had nothing but his honor and his service, and he died for it. What could he possibly have hidden?" I tried to calm her down, tried to tell her it was a misunderstanding, that I would figure it out, that she should stay with her neighbor Mrs. Shevchenko for a few days, just to be safe. But even as I said the words, I knew they were empty promises, because I had no power to protect her from whatever this was. No resources to send security or hire protection or do anything except panic from an ocean away. When I finally got her settled enough to end the call, promising to phone again in the morning, I sat in my studio with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and understood with perfect clarity that Dmitry Volkov had been right, that I was already involved whether I wanted to be or not, that ignorance was not protection, but just another form of vulnerability. The business card was in my wallet, and I pulled it out with fingers that felt disconnected from my body, the simple white rectangle with its embossed black number seeming to pulse with significance in the harsh light. I thought about my father, about the stories my grandmother used to tell me of his service, his dedication, his absolute conviction that some things were worth dying for, and I wondered what he had known, what he had been part of, what legacy he had left me besides grief and pride, and apparently a target on my back. It was 2 in the morning when I finally pulled out my phone and dialed the number, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and the phone rang exactly once before his voice came through, calm and unsurprised and almost gentle. "Marina," Dmitri said, as if he had been waiting by the phone, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. "I am glad you called." "They went to my grandmother," I said, skipping past any pretense of greeting or small talk. 3 men, asking about my father, about his legacy, and you knew this would happen. You knew they would come for her." "I did not know the timeline," he said. But yes, I knew Viktor Orlov would eventually make the connection between you and what your father protected. I am sorry I could not warn you more specifically, but I was hoping we would have more time. Tell me everything, I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. No more games, no more hints and implications. If my grandmother is in danger because of something my father did, then I deserve to know the whole truth. There was a pause, and I could hear city sounds in the background on his end, cars and distant sirens, and I wondered where he was, if he was in his office or his home or somewhere else entirely. Come to my office, he said finally. This is not a conversation for phones. I will send a car to pick you up. We can talk properly, and I can show you what your father was protecting, what both our families have been protecting for decades. I looked around my studio, at the half-finished painting on my table, at my tools and solvents, and the careful restoration work that had been my entire world until a few days ago. And I knew that world was already gone, that whatever I had been before was being replaced by something I did not yet understand. Send the car, I said. And then because I needed him to know this was not surrender but strategy, I added, but if you are lying to me, if any of this is manipulation, I will find a way to make you regret it. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or just an exhale. I would expect nothing less, he said. The car will be there in 20 minutes, and Marina, thank you for trusting me enough to call. I did not trust him, I wanted to say, I just had no other options, but the line was already dead, and I was already gathering my things, already locking up the studio, already stepping into the elevator that would take me down to street level, where a black car with tinted windows was probably already waiting. The drive to Tribeca took less time than it should have, the late-night streets empty enough that we made every light, and I sat in the back seat watching Manhattan slide past the windows and trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to learn, whatever impossible choice I was about to be offered. The building Dmitri's office was in was all glass and steel and money, the kind of place where even the doorman looked like he earned more than I did, and I was escorted to a private elevator that required a keycard and opened directly into a penthouse that took my breath away, despite my determination not to be impressed. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city, Manhattan glittering like a jewelry box spilled across black velvet, and the space itself was all clean lines and minimal furniture, expensive in that way that looked effortless, but required armies of designers and decorators. Dmitri was standing by the windows, still in a suit despite the hour, and he turned when the elevator doors opened with an expression I could not quite read. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned across from a massive desk that looked like it was carved from a single piece of dark wood. "Please sit. Would you like coffee, tea, something stronger?" "I want answers," I said, remaining standing because sitting felt too much like accepting hospitality, too much like becoming comfortable in a space that was designed to make people feel small. "My grandmother is terrified. Men are threatening her because of something my father supposedly protected. And you clearly know what that something is. So talk." He nodded, as if he had expected my directness, and he moved to the wall behind his desk, where I now noticed there were photographs in simple frames. Family photos that seemed out of place in the minimalist perfection of the rest of the office. "This is my mother," he said, pointing to a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and eyes that looked like his, her smile captured in what looked like summer sunlight. She was born in Kharkiv in 1968. Her name was Katerina Bondarenko before she married my father and became Katerina Volkova. The woman in the photograph could have been any Ukrainian woman of that generation, pretty and hopeful and unaware of what history had in store for her. And I felt something twist in my chest at the ordinariness of her, the humanness. "She met my father in Moscow in 1989, Dmitri continued, his voice taking on a quality I had not heard before, something softer and more raw. He was already involved in what would later become his business empire, and she was a university student studying art history. They should never have crossed paths, but they did. And against all advice and common sense, they fell in love. I wanted to tell him I did not care about his parents' love story, that I needed information, not sentiment, but something in his expression stopped me. Some grief that I recognized from my own mirror. They married in 1990, he said, and I was born a year later, and my mother tried very hard to be Russian, to fit into my father's world, to leave her Ukrainian identity behind like clothes that no longer fit. But she could not completely abandon who she was, where she came from, what her family had endured. He touched another photograph, this one of a group of people, older, standing in front of what looked like a farmhouse. Her father, my grandfather Mykola, was part of the resistance during the Soviet era, he said quietly. Not the official resistance, not the groups that made it into history books, but the quiet resistance of people who documented crimes, who kept records, who believed that someday someone would care about justice. He and others like him spent decades collecting evidence of what was done to Ukrainian families, villages that were starved, people who disappeared, the systematic erasure of culture and language and identity, and they hid this evidence, waiting for a time when it could be used. The pieces were starting to come together in my mind, a picture forming that I did not want to see but could not look away from. In the late 1980s, Dmitry continued, when it became clear that the Soviet Union was collapsing, my grandfather knew that the evidence he had collected would be valuable but also dangerous. There were people who had committed crimes who would do anything to keep those crimes buried. He gave the evidence to my mother when she moved to Moscow, entrusted her to keep it safe until it could be used properly, and she hid it the only way she knew how, inside something that would be valuable enough to protect, but innocuous enough not to draw attention. Inside a painting, I said, understanding flooding through me. Inside the Repin painting. He nodded, turning back to face me fully, his gray eyes reflecting the city lights behind me. The painting belonged to her family originally, acquired by her grandfather before the war, and she had it sent to her in Moscow supposedly for sentimental reasons. Had the frame specially made by someone she trusted, someone who knew how to hide microfilm in wood in a way that would not be detected by casual inspection. For years it hung in our home, just another piece of art, and my father never knew what it really contained. And your mother? I asked. What happened to her? She died when I was 12, he said, and the grief in his voice was old but still sharp. Cancer, sudden and aggressive. And before she died, she told me everything, made me promise to keep the evidence safe, to use it when the time was right to bring justice to the families who had been erased, including her own. I was a child, I did not fully understand, but I kept the promise, I kept the painting safe, moved it between secure locations, and 5 years ago, I arranged for it to be placed in the Hartley Museum's collection under the guise of a donation, knowing their security and climate control would preserve it better than I could. But someone found out, I said. Someone knew what the painting really contained. Viktor Orlov, Dmitry confirmed, his voice going cold. His father was one of the men my grandfather documented, one of the officials who orchestrated the starvation of entire villages, who signed the orders that sent thousands to camps, who profited from the suffering of Ukrainian families, including my mother's. Orlov Sr. is dead now, died wealthy and respected and unpunished, but his son Viktor has built his empire on that blood money. And he knows that if the evidence my mother protected ever comes to light, his family's legacy will be destroyed, their assets could be seized, their name will become synonymous with genocide. So he stole the painting, I said, to destroy the evidence. Not just to destroy it, Dmitry said, but to use it as leverage against me, against anyone else who might have copies or know what it contains. He wants to make sure that the truth stays buried, and that anyone who might expose it is too afraid or too compromised to act. He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder that he handed to me. This is what I know about Viktor Orlov, he said. His business interests, his connections, his methods. And this is what I know about your father. I opened the folder with shaking hands and saw photographs of my father, younger than I remembered him, in military uniform, but also in civilian clothes, meeting with people I did not recognize. Your father was part of the same network as my grandfather, Dmitri said gently. He was one of the people who helped document evidence, who risked his life to preserve the truth. And when my mother died and I was too young to fully understand what I had inherited, your father was one of the people who helped me keep the evidence safe, who taught me why it mattered. I stared at a photograph of my father, shaking hands with an older man I now recognized from Dmitri's family photos as his grandfather, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes. He never told me, I whispered. He never said anything about this. He was protecting you, Dmitri said. The less you knew, the safer you were. Or that was the theory. But now Orlov has made the connection, has realized that the daughter of Andrei Kovalenko might know something, might have access to information or evidence, and he will not stop until he has eliminated every possible threat. This is not just about money or power, he continued, moving to stand beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with coffee, and something else. This is about justice for people who were erased, for families like my mother's who lost everything, for the historical record that men like Orlov's father tried to destroy. Why should I believe you? I asked, looking up at him, my vision blurred with unshed tears. You are Russian Mafia. You have lied to me, manipulated me, invaded my privacy. Why should I trust anything you say? My mother was Ukrainian, he said quietly, switching to Ukrainian for the first time since I had arrived. Her family was destroyed by men like Orlov's father. I am both Russian and Ukrainian, and I choose which side of that history to honor. I choose my mother's legacy over my father's empire. I choose justice over profit, and I need your help to make that choice mean something. What do you need from me? I asked, even though I already knew, even though the answer was obvious. Orlov will sell the painting at a private auction in the Hamptons in 4 days, Dmitri said, switching back to English. He needs to move it quickly before I can organize a proper response. And he will sell it to a private collector who will take it out of the country where I cannot touch it. But the buyer will want authentication, will want proof that it is the real repin and not a forgery. And you are one of the few people in the world who can provide that authentication, who knows that painting intimately enough to verify it beyond doubt. You want me to go to this auction? I said slowly. Verify the painting is real. And then what? You steal it back? My men will retrieve it, he confirmed. But I need to know it is the real painting and not a decoy. Orlov is smart enough to create a convincing fake, and I cannot risk moving against a forgery while the real painting disappears. I need you there. I need your expertise. And in exchange, I will make the FBI investigation disappear completely. I will ensure your visa is extended. I have connections in immigration. And most importantly, I will protect your grandmother. I will have security on her within hours. People who will make sure Orlov's men never get near her again. I looked out at the Manhattan skyline, at the city that had promised me so much and delivered mostly struggle, and I thought about my father and what he had risked, what he had believed in enough to die for. If I do this, I said, if I help you, I want proof you will protect my grandmother. I want to see evidence that she is safe before I agree to anything. She will have security by morning, Dmitri said, and I will send you photographs, video confirmation, whatever you need to believe me. And Marina, I know you do not trust me. I know I have given you many reasons not to, but I swear on my mother's memory that I will keep your grandmother safe, that I will honor your father's legacy, that I will not let Orlov destroy what they spent their lives protecting. I turned to face him fully, this man who was both Russian and Ukrainian, both criminal and crusader, both the person who had violated my privacy and the only person offering me a way to protect my family. Welcome to my world, he said softly, and I nodded. accepting the invitation and the threat and the impossible choice, knowing that I had just stepped across a line I could never uncross, into a life I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. They arrived at my apartment at 9 in the morning, a team of 5 people carrying garment bags and makeup cases and an air of professional efficiency that made Jessica stare open-mouthed from the kitchen where she was eating cereal. Marina Kovalenko, the woman in charge said, her accent vaguely European and her clothing more expensive than everything in my closet combined. I am Irina. Mr. Volkov has sent us to prepare you for this evening. We have much work to do. I wanted to slam the door in their faces, wanted to call Dmitri and tell him that sending strangers to invade my apartment again was not acceptable, but I had agreed to this, had accepted his help and his protection and his world. And apparently, his world included being dressed like a doll by people who looked at my paint-stained jeans and bare face with barely concealed horror. Jessica was asking questions I could not answer, her eyes wide with confusion and excitement, and I sent her to her room with a promise to explain later, even though I had no idea how to explain any of this. The next 3 hours were a blur of being measured and prodded and critiqued, my hair pulled and my skin examined, and my entire body treated like a canvas that needed extensive restoration. Irina and her team worked with ruthless precision, waxing and buffing and conditioning, and I sat through it with gritted teeth, feeling objectified and transformed in equal measure. The dresses they brought were obscene in their beauty and their cost, gowns that belonged in magazines or on red carpets, and when Irina finally selected one, an emerald silk that caught the light like water, I stared at the price tag that someone had forgotten to remove and felt physically ill. "This is insane," I said, holding the dress away from me like it might bite. "I cannot accept this. This costs more than I make in a year." "You can and you will," Irina said calmly, slipping the dress off the hanger with practiced ease. "Tonight you are not a restoration specialist. You are Mr. Volkov's companion, and you must look the part. Now stop arguing and let us finish." The dress fit like it had been made for me, which I supposed it had been given how thoroughly they had measured every inch of my body, and when I finally looked in the mirror that they had somehow produced and set up in my tiny living room, I did not recognize the woman staring back. My hair was swept up in something elegant and complicated. My makeup made my eyes look enormous and my lips fuller, and the emerald silk draped over my body in ways that suggested everything while revealing nothing, transforming me into someone who belonged in Dmitri's world of glass towers and private auctions. Irina nodded with satisfaction, stepping back to admire her work. "Perfect," she said. "Mr. Volkov will be very pleased." I did not want Dmitri to be pleased, did not want to care what he thought of how I looked, but when he arrived exactly at 6 as promised, and I opened the door to find him in a tuxedo that made him look like he had stepped out of a film about beautiful, dangerous men, something in my chest tightened painfully. He stopped mid-step, his hand frozen on the doorframe, and for a long moment, he just stared at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded that made my skin flush hot. "Marina," he said finally, my name coming out rough, almost reverent, and then he seemed to remember himself, and his professional mask slid back into place. "You look beautiful." The compliment should not have mattered, should not have sent warmth spreading through me, but it did, and I hated myself for it. "Can we just go?" I said, brushing past him into the hallway. "The sooner we do this, the sooner I can go back to my real life." The car waiting downstairs was not the sedan from before, but something longer and more luxurious, and inside was a man I had not met, broad-shouldered with a scar across his left cheek and eyes that assessed me with professional detachment. "This is Alexei," Dmitri said as we settled into the leather seats. "My head of security. He will brief us on the plan for this evening." Alexei nodded at me once, then pulled out a tablet and began explaining the layout of the Hampton estate, the security measures, the guest list, the timing of the auction. I tried to focus on his words, on the strategic details of how we would identify the painting and signal Dimitri's team and extract ourselves before anyone realized what had happened. But I kept being distracted by Dimitri's presence beside me. The heat of his body in the confined space, the way his hand rested on the seat between us close enough that I could feel it without touching. The drive took nearly 2 hours, traffic and distance combining to make the journey feel interminable, and by the time we pulled up to the estate, I was wound so tight I thought I might shatter. The house was obscene in its grandeur, old money and new money colliding in a sprawling mansion that overlooked the ocean. And I could see other cars arriving, other couples in evening wear, the kind of people for whom a private art auction was just another Saturday night. Dimitri helped me out of the car, his hand warm on mine, and then he did something unexpected. He pulled me close and spoke quietly against my ear. "Remember," he said, his breath warm on my skin. "You are my girlfriend. We are wealthy and in love and here to admire art. Stay close to me. Let me do most of the talking, and when you see the painting, just give me the signal we discussed." A touch on my wrist. Nothing obvious. I nodded, not trusting my voice. And then we were walking into the house, and I was bombarded with sensory overload. Crystal chandeliers and marble floors and artwork on every wall. The murmur of Russian and English and other languages I could not identify. The clink of champagne glasses and the subtle perfume of wealth that smelled like power and corruption and old sins. Dimitri kept his hand possessive on my lower back, steering me through the crowd with easy confidence, and I tried to play my part, smiling when introduced to people whose names I immediately forgot, accepting champagne I did not drink, admiring paintings I barely saw because I was too focused on looking for the repin. The auction room was set up in what must have been a ballroom, velvet chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small stage where the paintings would be displayed, and I scanned the catalog that had been provided, my heart sinking when I saw the repin listed as Lot 17, which meant we had to sit through 16 other paintings first. Dimitri guided me to seats in the middle, not too close to the front, but not so far back as to seem uninterested, and as we sat, I became acutely aware of every point where his body touched mine, his thigh against mine, his arm along the back of my chair, his fingers occasionally brushing my shoulder in a way that could have been casual or could have been deliberate. The auction began, and I tried to pay attention, tried to look appropriately interested in a Kandinsky and a Chagall and various other works that probably cost more than my entire education, but I kept scanning the room, looking for anyone who might be Viktor Orlov based on the description Alexei had provided. When I finally saw him, standing near the back of the room speaking with another silver-haired man, I felt my stomach drop because he looked so utterly normal, charming even, nothing in his appearance suggesting the monster Dmitri had described. I watched Dmitri notice Orlov, watched his entire demeanor shift in a way so subtle I would have missed it if I had not been sitting pressed against him, every muscle going taut, his breathing changing rhythm, his hand on my shoulder tightening just slightly. Then Orlov looked our way and smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes, and he said something to his companion before moving in our direction. Dmitri stood smoothly, pulling me up with him, and when Orlov reached us, he extended his hand and spoke in Russian. Words I did not understand, but could read in the tone, polite and poisonous. Dmitri responded in kind, his Russian cold and formal, and they shook hands like civilized men while I stood there feeling like a prop in a play I had not rehearsed for. Then Orlov turned to me and switched to perfect English. "And who is this lovely creature?" he asked, his eyes traveling over me in a way that made my skin crawl. Dimitri's hand moved to my waist, pulling me closer to his side. "This is Marina," he said, his accent thickening slightly the way it did when he was stressed. "My girlfriend. She has an appreciation for Russian art." Orlov's smile widened and he took my hand, kissing it in a gesture that should have been charming, but felt like a threat. "A pleasure," he said. And then he switched to Ukrainian, the change so sudden it took me a moment to process. And what does a beautiful Ukrainian woman see in a Russian businessman, I wonder? The question was a test, and I knew it, but hearing my language from his mouth, from the son of the man who had destroyed families like mine, made rage flash hot through my veins. I see a man who honors his Ukrainian mother's memory, I responded in Ukrainian, keeping my voice level with effort, unlike some who profit from their father's crimes. Orlov's smile did not falter, but his eyes went cold, dead, and he switched back to English. "How interesting," he said. "Dmitri has found himself a patriot. How very touching." "The auction is starting," Dmitri said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "If you will excuse us." We returned to our seats and I was shaking, adrenaline making my hands unsteady, and Dmitri leaned close and whispered, "You should not have engaged with him." He was speaking Ukrainian, I said, my voice fierce and low. He was testing me, and I was not going to fail by staying silent. Dmitri's hand found mine in my lap, squeezed once, a gesture that could have been warning or comfort or both. "Just stay close to me," he said, "and try not to let him provoke you again." The auction continued, and I tried to focus on the paintings, but all I could think about was Orlov's dead eyes and the way he had looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. And then Lot 17 was being brought out and my breath caught, because there it was, the repin I had spent months restoring, the painting I knew more intimately than almost any other work of art. I studied it as the auctioneer described its provenance and significance, my trained eye cataloging every detail, the specific craquelure pattern in the upper left corner, the slight variation in the signature where Repin's hand had trembled, the nearly invisible repair I had made to a small tear near the bottom edge. It was real, absolutely authentic, and I touched Dmitri's wrist lightly, our prearranged signal, and felt him exhale beside me. The bidding started and climbed quickly, numbers that made my head spin, and I watched as Dmitri bid once, twice, driving the price up, but never quite high enough to win, playing the role of interested buyer who was ultimately outbid by a man in the front row who I assumed was Orlov's plant. When the auction concluded and people began mingling again, champagne flowing more freely now, Dmitri excused himself to take a call, and I was left standing alone near a painting of a winter landscape, trying to look casual and failing miserably. I did not see Orlov approach until he was beside me, appearing with the sudden silence of a predator, and when he spoke it was in Ukrainian again, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "Your father thought he could betray his employers and hide behind patriotism," he said conversationally, like we were discussing the weather. "He thought that documenting crimes made him a hero rather than a traitor. He was wrong." The rage that flooded through me was white-hot and overwhelming, burning away caution and strategy and the careful control I had been maintaining. "My father died defending people you destroyed," I said in rapid Ukrainian, my voice shaking with fury. "My father was a hero who stood against men like your father who starved children and murdered families and called it policy. Do not speak his name, you are not worthy to even think of him." Orlov's smile was triumphant, and I realized too late what I had done, how thoroughly I had just confirmed everything he suspected. "So passionate," he said, switching back to English as Dmitri appeared at my side, tension radiating from him in waves. "Your girlfriend is very loyal to her father's memory. How charming." Dmitri's hand on my arm was almost painful in its grip, pulling me away from Orlov with barely restrained violence. "If you will excuse us," he said, each word precise and cold. We left the room, left the house, and did not speak until we were in the car pulling away from the estate, Alexei in the front seat already on his phone coordinating something I could not hear. "You should not have engaged with him," Dmitri said again, his voice tight. "You should not have let him provoke you." "He called my father a traitor," I shot back. What was I supposed to do? Smile and nod? "He was testing you," Dmitri said, turning to face me fully, "and you confirmed exactly what he wanted to know, that you care deeply about your father's legacy, that you know something about what your father was involved in, that you are emotionally invested in this, beyond just being my companion for the evening." I know what my father was, he continued, his voice softening slightly. A hero. A man who risked everything for justice. A man worthy of your loyalty and your rage. But now Orlov knows you are not just here as my date. He knows you care, and that makes you a target in ways I cannot fully protect you from. The car was silent, except for the sound of tires on pavement and the distant murmur of Alexei's phone conversation. And I looked at Dmitri in his perfect tuxedo with his ice-gray eyes and his carefully controlled fury. And I understood that we had both just crossed lines we could not uncross, that the game had changed, and we were no longer playing at being a couple, but had become something more complicated and more dangerous. Your men can retrieve the painting now, I said quietly. I confirmed it is authentic. I did what you needed me to do. They are already moving, Dmitri said, watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. By tomorrow morning the painting will be in my possession and the evidence will be recovered, but Orlov will know it was me, will know you helped, and he will retaliate. Then we deal with it, I said, with more confidence than I felt. We finish what our fathers started. Dmitri reached out and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek, and the gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that I froze. You are braver than you know, he said softly, and more beautiful than you should be, and I am sorry I brought you into this world, but I am not sorry I met you. The words hung between us in the darkness of the car, heavy with implications I was not ready to examine, and when he leaned closer, I did not pull away, did not stop him when his lips brushed mine in a kiss that tasted like champagne and danger, and promises neither of us should make. The kiss deepened, and I let myself forget for a moment about paintings and evidence and dead fathers and living threats. Let myself just feel the heat of his mouth and the strength of his hands and the impossible pull between us that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with two people who recognized in each other the same wounds, the same losses, the same desperate need to make the past mean something. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Dmitri rested his forehead against mine and said something in Russian I did not understand, and I did not ask for translation because some things were better left in languages that gave us permission to be vulnerable. The rest of the drive back to Manhattan passed in charged silence, his hand finding mine in the darkness, and I knew that everything had changed again, that we had moved past allies of convenience into territory far more dangerous than any auction or stolen painting, into the kind of connection that could save us or destroy us, and probably both. The auction at the Hamptons estate had gone exactly as Dmitri predicted. Wealthy collectors in evening wear sipping champagne and bidding on stolen art with the casual indifference of people for whom money was just a way of keeping score, and I had stood beside Dmitri in the emerald gown his people had dressed me in, playing the role of his cultured girlfriend, while my heart hammered against my ribs, and I waited for my moment to examine the painting. When they brought out the repin, displayed on an easel under carefully positioned lights, I had moved closer with the excuse of admiring the brushwork, and I had seen immediately that it was authentic, had recognized the specific craquelure pattern in the upper left corner that I had documented in my restoration notes, had identified the small repair I had made to a tear in the canvas near the bottom edge, invisible to anyone who had not spent hours studying every centimeter of the surface. I had given Dmitri the slightest nod, our agreed-upon signal, and he had made a call to his men who were positioned to intercept the painting during its transport to the buyer's private jet. And then we had left the auction, his hand warm and possessive on my lower back, and I had told myself that the way my body responded to his touch was just adrenaline, just the relief of having survived the evening without being discovered. The drive back to Manhattan had been quiet, Dmitri making calls in Russian to coordinate his team, while I watched the Hamptons estates give way to highway, give way to the city rising up around us like a familiar cage. And by the time we reached his Tribeca penthouse, it was past midnight, and I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, into something that felt like my bones were trying to escape my body. You should stay here tonight, Dmitri had said, as we stepped out of the elevator into his apartment. It is late, and you are tired, and I have guest rooms, plural. You can have your choice and your privacy, and in the morning we will know if my men were successful in retrieving the painting. I should have said no, should have insisted on going home to my cramped Brooklyn apartment and my own bed and some distance from this man who made me feel things I could not afford to feel. But the thought of the subway at this hour, of climbing those 5 flights of stairs, of facing Jessica's inevitable questions about where I had been dressed like I was going to the Met Gala, it was all too much, and I heard myself agreeing. He showed me to a guest room that was larger than my entire bedroom at home, all white linens and soft lighting, and an ensuite bathroom with a shower that probably cost more than my car. And he provided me with silk pajamas that his housekeeper apparently kept on hand for unexpected guests, which made me wonder how many women had stayed in this room, how many had worn these same pajamas, how many had been part of whatever game he was playing. I showered and changed and tried to sleep, but my mind would not quiet, kept replaying moments from the evening, the way Dmitri had introduced me to Orlov with perfect civility while tension crackled between them like electricity, the way Orlov had looked at me with cold calculation like he was trying to determine my value and my vulnerabilities, the way the whole glittering world of wealth and art and crime had felt both foreign and somehow inevitable, like I had been moving toward it my whole life without knowing. At 2 in the morning I gave up on sleep and wandered out of the guest room, drawn by restlessness and curiosity and the need to understand more about the man who had pulled me into his orbit, and I found myself in his study, the room I had only glimpsed earlier when he had shown me his mother's photographs. The city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows provided enough illumination to see by, and I moved around the space looking at the carefully curated elements of his life, the expensive furniture and the art on the walls, and the books on the shelves that suggested an actual reader rather than a decorator's props. The desk was massive and dark and organized with the precision of someone who controlled chaos for a living, and I told myself I was not going to snoop, was not going to violate his privacy the way he had violated mine. But then I saw the locked drawer, and something in me snapped. I went back to the guest room and retrieved one of my restoration tools, a thin metal pick I always carried for delicate work, and I returned to the study and knelt beside the drawer and worked the lock with hands that were steadier than they should have been, steadier than they had any right to be, given that I was breaking into a Mafia boss's private files at 2 in the morning. The lock clicked open after less than a minute, and I pulled the drawer open and found a folder with my name on it, Marina Kovalenko written in neat Cyrillic on the tab, and my stomach dropped even before I opened it and saw what was inside. Surveillance photographs of me, dozens of them spanning months, me leaving my apartment building, me walking into the museum, me at a coffee shop near work, me on the subway reading a book, me living my life completely unaware that I was being watched and documented and studied like one of the paintings I restored. There were printed emails between Dmitri and someone named Alexei discussing the Kovalenko girl as potential asset, debating whether I could be trusted, whether I had the skills necessary, whether my emotional connection to my father's legacy would make me pliable or volatile. There were copies of my personnel file from the museum, my visa application, my graduate school transcripts, my bank statements going back 6 months, every detail of my life laid out like evidence in a case I had not known I was part of. There were notes in Dimitri's handwriting, observations about my schedule, my habits, my vulnerabilities, clinical and detached like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. The earliest document in the folder was dated 8 months ago, a background report on me, triggered by his discovery that I was Andrei Kovalenko's daughter, and that I worked at the Hartley Museum where he had placed the painting, and I felt something break inside me as I understood that nothing about our meeting had been chance, that he had orchestrated everything from the moment he heard me speaking Ukrainian, that even that had probably been planned, him knowing I worked late, knowing I would be on the phone, positioning himself to overhear. 8 months, I whispered to the empty room, my hands shaking as I held the photographs. 8 months of watching me, planning this. And I never knew. I never even suspected. I heard the elevator doors open, heard his footsteps crossing the living room, and I did not try to hide what I had found, did not scramble to put things back or pretend I had not been snooping. I just stayed kneeling beside his desk, with the contents of the folder spread around me like accusations. He appeared in the doorway of the study, still in his dress shirt from the auction, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, and he stopped when he saw me, saw the open drawer, saw the photographs in my hands, and his expression did not change, did not show surprise or guilt or anything except a kind of weary resignation. 8 months, I said again, standing up and facing him, holding one of the surveillance photos like evidence. You have been watching me for 8 months. Yes, he said simply, not moving from the doorway, not trying to explain or justify, just acknowledging the truth. Everything, I continued, my voice getting louder. The fundraiser, the conversation you overheard, you standing in my studio looking surprised to hear Ukrainian. This was all planned, all of it. You knew exactly where I would be, and when I would be there, and what I would be doing. Not everything, he said quietly, taking a step into the room. How I feel about you, that was not planned. That was not part of the strategy. I laughed, and it sounded bitter and broken even to my own ears. How you feel about me, I repeated, switching to Ukrainian because I needed the comfort of my language for this betrayal. You used me, you manipulated me, you turned me into an asset in your game, and you expect me to believe you have feelings beyond strategic interest. He answered in Ukrainian, his voice soft but steady. I needed you, he said. There is a difference. I needed someone who could authenticate the painting, someone who had personal stake in destroying Orlov, someone who would understand why this mattered. And yes, I chose you deliberately. I orchestrated our meeting. I used your vulnerabilities and your father's legacy to pull you into this. But what I feel for you now, that is real. That developed despite my planning, not because of it. I wanted to throw the photographs at him, wanted to scream, wanted to do something that would make him feel even a fraction of the violation and betrayal that was tearing through me, but instead I just stood there, shaking and trying not to cry because I would not give him my tears, would not give him anything more than he had already taken. You had no right, I said, still in Ukrainian, no right to decide for me what risks I would take, what role I would play. You should have told me the truth from the beginning, should have given me the choice to help or not help, instead of manipulating me into it. If I had told you the truth at the beginning, he said, would you have believed me? Would you have helped? Or would you have run as far and fast as you could? I do not know, I admitted, but that should have been my decision to make, my choice, not yours. He moved closer, and I stepped back, maintaining distance, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been hurt. I am sorry, he said, and it sounded genuine even though I did not want to believe it. I am sorry I did not give you the choice. I am sorry I treated you like an asset instead of a person. I am sorry that I let strategy override ethics. But I am not sorry that I found you, that I brought you into this, because you are the only person who can help me finish what our fathers started, the only person I trust with this. Trust, I said, the word tasting like ash. You want to talk about trust when you have been lying to me from the moment we met? I have not lied to you, he said. I have withheld information. I have manipulated circumstances. But everything I have told you about the painting, about the evidence, about Orlov, about my mother and your father, all of that is true. I looked at the photographs spread across his desk, at my own face captured in dozens of unguarded moments, and I felt the weight of his surveillance like a physical thing pressing down on my chest. I need to leave, I said, switching back to English because Ukrainian felt too intimate now. Too much like a shared language between people who had something real. I need to get out of here and figure out what I am going to do, and I cannot think with you standing there looking at me like that. Marina, he started. But before he could finish, the elevator doors opened again, and a man I recognized from the auction, one of Dmitri's security team, burst into the penthouse with his phone in his hand and his face grim. "Alexei," Dmitri said sharply. "What is it? Did something go wrong with the retrieval?" "We got the painting," Alexei said in Russian. "But there is a problem. Orlov has made a move. He grabbed a girl from the Brooklyn apartment. Blonde American girl in her 20s. He thinks it is Marina. He is demanding an exchange. The girl for Marina. He has sent a video." My blood turned to ice, and I knew before Dmitri even turned to look at me, knew with terrible certainty what had happened. "Jessica," I whispered. "Oh God, Jessica." Dmitri took the phone from Alexei and watched the video, his expression hardening with each second, and then he turned the phone so I could see. And there was Jessica, my sweet, oblivious roommate who loved rescue dogs and terrible pop music and thought the best of everyone, tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse, crying and confused and terrified. The voice on the video was speaking Russian, but with subtitles in English, telling Dmitri that he had 24 hours to produce Marina Kovalenko or the girl would be killed, that this was what happened when people interfered with Viktor Orlov's business, that Dmitri should consider this a lesson in the cost of opposing him. "My roommate is innocent," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "This is my fault. This happened because of me, because Orlov thinks I know something or have something, and Jessica was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." "This is Orlov's fault," Dmitri said, his voice cold and controlled in a way that scared me more than anger would have, "and I will not let him have you. This is obviously a trap. He wants to draw you out, and once he has you, he will kill both you and your roommate." "I do not care if it is a trap," I said, looking from the video to Dmitri. "I am going. I am doing the exchange. Jessica has nothing to do with this, and I will not let her die, because I got pulled into your world." "You are not going," Dmitri said flatly. "I will handle this. I will get your roommate back. But I will not hand you over to Orlov. Do you understand? I will not let him hurt you." "You do not get to make that choice," I said, my earlier anger at his manipulation bleeding into this new crisis. "You do not get to decide what risks I take. This is my decision, and I am going to save Jessica even if you try to stop me." "Marina," he said, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not the calculated control I had seen at the auction, or the careful planning I had witnessed in our conversations, but actual fear, raw and unhidden. "If I let you go to Orlov, I will never see you again. He will kill you regardless of whether I return the painting. This is not about the art or the evidence anymore. This is about destroying everyone connected to your father's legacy, and I cannot. I will not lose you." I stared at him, this man who had surveilled me and manipulated me and pulled me into a world of stolen art and old crimes and dangerous men, and I saw in his gray eyes something I had been denying, something that made the betrayal hurt worse, because it suggested that maybe some of what he felt was real, even if the beginning had been calculated. "Then help me," I said quietly. "Help me get Jessica back safely. Use your resources and your planning and your strategy to make sure we both survive this. But do not ask me to let an innocent person die, because you are afraid of losing an asset." "You are not an asset," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "Not anymore. Maybe not ever really. And that is the problem. That is why I cannot think clearly about this, cannot be strategic when it is your life at stake." Alexei cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion in the room, and spoke in Russian to Dmitri. "We have 24 hours, he said. "We can set up counter-surveillance, position our people, turn Orlov's trap into our trap, but we need to move quickly." Dmitri looked at me for a long moment, city lights behind him and fear in his eyes, and something else I did not want to name, and then he nodded slowly. "We do this my way," he said to me in English. "You do not go alone. You do not go without protection. You follow my plan exactly, or I will lock you in this penthouse and handle it myself. Do you understand?" I understand, I said, even though I was already planning what I would do if his plan put Jessica at greater risk. Already preparing to betray his trust, the way he had betrayed mine if it meant saving my roommate. He turned to Alexei and started giving orders in rapid Russian, calls to make, people to position, equipment to prepare, and I stood in his study surrounded by evidence of his surveillance and manipulation, and thought about how we were both liars now, both willing to use each other if necessary, both trapped in a game that had started long before we met, and would not end until someone won or everyone lost. The photographs of me were still spread across his desk, like a story I had not known I was living, and I gathered them up and put them back in the folder and closed the drawer because I could not look at them anymore, could not face the evidence of how thoroughly I had been watched and assessed and chosen. And when I turned around, Dmitri was watching me with an expression I could not read. "I will get her back," he said quietly. "I promise you, Marina, I will get your roommate back safely, and I will make Orlov pay for this, for all of it." I nodded, but I did not thank him, because this was his world and his enemies and his choices that had brought danger to Jessica's door. And whatever complicated feelings were developing between us would have to wait until after we had survived the next 24 hours. Until after I knew whether trust was even possible between two people who had both learned to see others as pieces on a board rather than as people deserving of truth. The call came at 11:30 at night, Jessica's number flashing on my phone, and I knew before I answered that something terrible had happened because Jessica never called me. She texted everything from grocery lists to relationship drama in endless strings of emojis. Marina, the voice on the other end, was not Jessica, but a man speaking accented English. "Your roommate is with us and she is unharmed for now. If you want her to stay that way, you will come alone to the address I am about to send you. No police, no FBI, and certainly not your Russian boyfriend." The line went dead before I could respond, and a text message appeared with an address in Red Hook, an industrial area by the waterfront that I had never been to, never had reason to go to, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I was in Dimitri's penthouse, had been staying there for the past 2 days since the disaster at the Hamptons auction, where everything had gone wrong, where we had discovered the painting was a forgery and Orlov had already moved the real one somewhere we could not track. And now he had Jessica, and it was my fault. All of this was my fault, because I had dragged an innocent person into a world of violence and secrets that she had no part in. Dmitri was in his office on a call with his security team, and I could hear his voice through the door, that cold, authoritative tone he used when giving orders, and I stood there with my phone in my hand knowing exactly what I had to do, and knowing he would try to stop me. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression told me he already knew, that his people had intercepted the same information, that we were about to have the fight I had been preparing for. "They have Jessica," I said before he could speak, "and they want me in exchange, and I am going." "Marina," he started, his voice controlled but his eyes showing something close to panic. "This is obviously a trap. Orlov does not want your roommate, he wants you, and if you walk into that warehouse you may not walk out." "I know," I said, moving past him to grab my jacket, "but Jessica is there because of me, because I brought this into our apartment, into her life, and I will not let an innocent person die because I was too much of a coward to face the consequences of my choices." "If you think I am letting you walk into that warehouse unprotected," Dmitri said, following me, his hand catching my arm with enough pressure to stop me but not enough to hurt, "then you do not understand how this works. You do not understand what Orlov is capable of." "Then protect me," I said, turning to face him fully, meeting those ice-gray eyes that had haunted my dreams for weeks now. "But I am going, with your help or without it, so you can either work with me or stay out of my way." The moment stretched between us, his hand still on my arm, his jaw tight with the kind of anger that came from fear rather than rage, and I watched him make the calculation, watched him realize that I meant every word, and that trying to lock me in his penthouse would only make me hate him. "We do this my way," he said finally. releasing my arm but not stepping back. You wear a wire. You wear a tracking device. My men surround the location before you go in, and at the first sign that you are in immediate danger, we extract you whether the exchange is complete or not. Agreed, I said, even though I had no intention of leaving without Jessica. Even though I knew I would do whatever it took to get her out safely, even if it meant sacrificing myself. The drive to Red Hook took 40 minutes through empty streets, Dmitri beside me in the back seat, and Alexei driving with the kind of focused silence that suggested he was listening to communications I could not hear, coordinating the team that was supposedly moving into position around the warehouse. Dmitri had fitted me with a wire so thin I could barely feel it against my skin, and a tracking chip that he had placed in the lining of my jacket with hands that were steadier than mine would have been. "If he asks you to remove your jacket," Dmitri said quietly, staring out at the passing streetlights, "refuse, make any excuse, but keep the tracker on you." I nodded, my throat too tight for words, and I felt his hand find mine in the darkness of the car, his fingers lacing through mine with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else about him. "I will get you out," he said, and it was not a promise, but a vow. A statement of fact delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never failed at anything he truly committed to. "I will not let him hurt you." The warehouse loomed against the night sky, all broken windows and rusted metal, and I could smell the salt water of the harbor mixing with decades of industrial decay. Dimitri's men were invisible, but I knew they were there, positioned on rooftops and in abandoned buildings, waiting for his signal, and I stepped out of the car into the cold November air with my heart hammering against my ribs. The main entrance was a rolling metal door that had been left partially open, light spilling out into the darkness, and I ducked under it into a vast empty space that echoed with my footsteps. Jessica was tied to a chair in the center of the warehouse, illuminated by a single overhead light that swung slightly in some unfelt breeze, and even from a distance I could see she had been crying. Her mascara streaked down her face, her usually perfect hair disheveled. "Marina," she called out when she saw me, her voice breaking. "I am so sorry. I do not know what is happening. These men, they said you would know what they wanted." I started toward her, but a voice from the shadows stopped me, cultured and cold and speaking English with a Russian accent that was more refined than Dimitri's. "Miss Kovalenko, how good of you to join us," Viktor Orlov said, stepping into the light, and I finally saw the man who had orchestrated all of this, who had stolen the painting and threatened my grandmother and turned my life into a nightmare. He was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished in the way that old money often is, wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, and his eyes were the flat dead color of a shark. "Your roommate is unharmed as promised," he continued, gesturing to Jessica with one gloved hand, "and she will remain so as long as you cooperate, as long as you give me what I need." "What do you need?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "You have the painting, you won the auction. What more could you possibly want from me?" "The painting," Orlov said, pulling a cigarette from a silver case and lighting it with a gesture that suggested infinite patience, "is useless without the key, and your father, sentimental fool that he was, hid the key in the last place anyone would think to. Look, in something so personal, so intimate, that it would take someone who knew him, who loved him, to unlock it." I felt the blood drain from my face as understanding crashed over me. "The microfilm," I said slowly. "It is encrypted." "Digitally encrypted," Orlov confirmed, "with a key that your father encoded in a lullaby. A Ukrainian lullaby he used to sing to you as a child. I have audio recordings of him singing it, intercepted communications from his time with the resistance. But the key is not in the words or the melody alone. It is in the specific way he sang it, the rhythm, the pauses, the tiny variations that made his version unique, and only someone who heard it repeatedly, who internalized it as memory rather than data, can reproduce it accurately enough to decrypt the evidence. I do not remember any lullaby, I lied, even though I could already hear it in my head, that song my father had sung to me every night before bed, the one that had followed me into adulthood, that I hummed sometimes without thinking when I was stressed or sad or homesick. Your grandmother is in a car outside Lviv, Orlov said, pulling out his phone and showing me a photograph that made my stomach drop. She is with some of my associates, and they are waiting for my instructions. One call from me, and she will disappear the way so many Ukrainian grandmothers disappeared during the Soviet era, erased without a trace, without a grave, without even a record that she existed. The photograph showed my Baba sitting in the back of a car, her face pale and frightened, and I could see a man's hand on her shoulder, could see the gun barely visible in the frame's edge. "I will kill you," I said, the words coming out flat and cold. "If you hurt her, I will find a way to kill you myself." "I believe you would try," Orlov said, almost admiringly. "You have your father's fire, his stubborn Ukrainian pride. But you also have his weakness, his sentimentality, his inability to sacrifice the individual for the greater good. So you will sing me the lullaby. You will give me the key, and in exchange your grandmother lives, and your roommate goes home, and you can tell yourself you had no choice." Through the wire I could hear Dmitri's voice, faint but urgent. "Do not do it, Marina. We are in position. We can extract you both. Just stall him." But I knew there was not time, knew that any delay might result in a phone call that would end my grandmother's life. "Nich yaka misyakna," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, the words coming back to me from childhood, from my father's voice mixing with my own. "Zorista, yasnaya." I sang the way my father had taught me, with the specific pauses he had always used, the slight emphasis on certain syllables that I had thought was just his accent, but now understood was code, was encryption, was a key hiding in plain sight as a father's love for his daughter. Tears were streaming down my face as I sang, each word a betrayal of everything my father had died protecting, but I could not stop, could not sacrifice my grandmother for the sake of evidence and justice and the abstract greater good. Orlov was recording me on his phone, his expression one of satisfaction, and I hated him with a purity that almost frightened me, hated him for forcing this choice, for weaponizing my family, for turning my father's love into a tool of destruction. The warehouse erupted in noise and movement before I finished the second verse, men in tactical gear pouring in from every entrance, and I heard Dmitri's voice shouting orders in Russian and English, telling his men to secure the perimeter, to get Jessica out, to take Orlov alive if possible. Gunfire echoed off the metal walls, making my ears ring, and I dropped to the ground instinctively, covering my head with my arms while chaos exploded around me. I felt hands grab me, and for a moment I thought it was rescue, thought Dmitri had reached me, but then I felt the cold press of metal against my temple and realized Orlov had moved faster than anyone anticipated. "Stand down!" Orlov shouted, his voice cutting through the noise, "or I will paint these walls with her brilliant Ukrainian brain." The gunfire stopped, sudden and complete, and I was hauled to my feet with Orlov's arm around my throat, and his gun pressed so hard against my skull that I could feel the imprint of the barrel. Dmitri emerged from behind a shipping container, his own weapon drawn and aimed at Orlov's head, but I could see the impossible calculation in his eyes, the knowledge that he could not take the shot without risking me. "Let her go," Dmitri said, his voice deadly calm. "You have what you wanted. You have the recording. Let her go and you can walk out of here." "What I want," Orlov said, his breath hot against my ear, "is to destroy everything your Ukrainian mother tried to protect, all those righteous little resistance fighters who thought they could preserve their truth, their history, their pathetic stand against inevitability. I want to erase it all the way my father erased whole villages, and I will start with this girl who carries that legacy in her voice, in her memory, in her blood." Dmitri's hand was absolutely steady on his weapon, but his eyes met mine across the space between us, and I saw something in them I had never seen before. Raw fear, mixed with a kind of desperate love that made my chest ache even through the terror. The shot came from somewhere to my left, not from Dmitri, but from Alexei, who had positioned himself at an angle that gave him a clear line to Orlov's shoulder, and the impact made Orlov's grip loosen just enough for me to drop my full weight downward, becoming a dead weight in his arms. His gun went off next to my ear, the sound deafening, but the bullet went wide, and then Dmitri was there, tackling Orlov to the ground while his men swarmed in to secure him. I lay on the filthy warehouse floor with my ears ringing and my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, and then Dmitri was pulling me up, his hands running over me checking for injuries, his face showing more emotion than I had ever seen from him. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his accent thicker than usual. "Marina, look at me, are you hurt?" I shook my head, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened. And he pulled me against his chest so hard I could barely breathe, one hand in my hair and the other pressed against my back like he was trying to absorb me into himself. "I thought I lost you," he said quietly, in Ukrainian, and his voice was shaking. "I thought I was going to watch you die, and there was nothing I could do to stop it." Jessica was being untied by one of Dmitri's men, sobbing and asking questions that no one was answering. And Orlov was on the ground with Alexei's knee in his back and zip ties around his wrists, still conscious but clearly in pain from the shoulder wound. "The recording," I said, pulling back enough to look at Dmitri's face. "He has the recording of the lullaby on his phone." "Alexei already has it," Dmitri said, gesturing to where his head of security was going through Orlov's pockets, pulling out the phone and holding it up. "And we will make sure every copy is destroyed, every trace of that recording erased." "But I already sang it," I said, feeling the weight of what I had done crushing down on me. "I gave him what he wanted. I betrayed everything my father protected." "You protected your grandmother," Dmitri corrected gently, cupping my face in his hands. "You made an impossible choice, under impossible circumstances, and your father would understand that. He would forgive you, because he loved you more than he loved any cause, or principle, or abstract notion of justice." The warehouse was filling with more of Dmitri's men, and in the distance I could hear sirens approaching, and I knew that somehow he would handle this, would make it disappear the way he made everything disappear, would protect me from the consequences of this night the way he had promised to protect my grandmother. Orlov was being dragged to his feet, blood seeping through his expensive coat, and he looked at me with eyes full of hate. "Your father died for nothing," he said, his voice full of venom. "All that evidence, all those carefully documented crimes, it will never see daylight. I will make sure of it. I have copies, I have insurance, and even if you kill me, the truth dies with me." "The truth does not die," I said, finding my voice finally, finding the strength my father had tried to give me through that lullaby, through his love and his sacrifice. "It just waits, and men like you always underestimate how long we are willing to wait, how patient justice can be." Dmitri's men took Orlov away, and I sagged against Dmitri, all the adrenaline draining out of me at once, leaving me shaking and cold and so tired I could barely stand. Jessica was being led out to a waiting car, still crying, still confused, and I knew I would have to explain something to her eventually, but right now I could not find the words, could not find anything except the desperate need to close my eyes and pretend this was all a nightmare I could wake up from. "I have you," Dmitri said quietly, lifting me into his arms like I weighed nothing. "I have you, and I am not letting go, not now, not ever." The gun was cold against my temple, and I could feel Orlov's breath on my neck as he backed us toward the warehouse exit, his arm locked around my throat just tight enough to make breathing difficult. And through the ringing in my ears from the gunfire, I could hear Dmitri's voice, steady and calm, telling Orlov to let me go, that he had what he wanted, that there was no need for this to end with more violence. Orlov laughed, a harsh sound that made me flinch, and he said something in Russian that I did not fully catch, but the tone was mocking, triumphant. And I knew with horrible clarity that he was not going to let me go, that I was leverage or a message or just collateral damage in a war that had started before I was born. My mind was racing, trying to find some way out, some action I could take that would not result in a bullet through my skull, and then I remembered something my father used to say, that the most powerful weapon was not strength, but the enemy's assumptions, their certainty that they knew what you would do next. I started humming the lullaby again, the one Orlov thought was the key to decrypting the evidence, and I felt him tense against me. Felt his grip shift slightly as he tried to understand why I was giving him what he wanted now, after he had threatened my grandmother, after he had put a gun to my head. Nicz yaka misyakna, I sang softly in Ukrainian, Zorista, Yasnaya, and I made my voice shake like I was terrified, which I was. But I also changed the rhythm, altered the pauses, shifted the melody in ways that were subtle but deliberate, ways my father had taught me without telling me why, without explaining that he was encoding protection into something as simple as a bedtime song. I kept my eyes locked on Dmitri's across the warehouse floor, past the frozen tableau of his men and Orlov's men all holding weapons, but not firing because their bosses had not given the order, and I saw the moment Dmitri understood what I was doing, saw his gray eyes widen fractionally, and then narrow, with something that looked like pride mixed with fear. He touched his earpiece, his lips moving in words I could not hear, and I knew he was telling his men to wait, to hold position, that something was happening that required patience rather than action. I continued singing, letting the false lullaby pour out of me while my mind calculated angles and possibilities. And then I did the only thing I could think of, the only move Orlov would not expect from a terrified art restorer who had never been in a fight in her life. I went completely limp, let my full weight drop like a puppet with cut strings, and Orlov stumbled backward, his arm loosening around my throat as he tried to compensate for the sudden shift, and in that fraction of a second when his balance was compromised and his gun was not quite pressed against my head anymore, Dmitri fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and I felt Orlov jerk behind me, felt hot blood spray across my shoulder, and then I was falling, hitting the concrete floor hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs, and there were hands on me, Dmitri's hands, pulling me away from Orlov, who was on the ground clutching his shoulder and screaming in Russian, while Dmitri's men swarmed him, kicking away his weapon and securing his hands with zip ties. "Are you hurt?" Dmitri was asking, his hands running over me with professional efficiency checking for wounds. "Marina, are you hurt? Talk to me." "I am okay," I managed to say, though my voice came out hoarse and my ears were still ringing. "I am okay, is he? Did you kill him?" "Non-lethal," Dmitri said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "Shoulder shot, he will live to face justice. But Marina, what you did, the lullaby, you changed it." "I gave him the wrong key," I said, starting to shake now that the immediate danger had passed, starting to feel the full weight of what had just happened, my father taught me. He made me promise, and I did not understand why until now. Dmitri pulled me against his chest, and I could feel his heart hammering as hard as mine, could feel the fine tremor in his hands that meant he was not as calm as he appeared, and for a moment we just stayed there on the filthy warehouse floor while chaos erupted around us, while Orlov was dragged away cursing and bleeding, and my roommate Jessica was freed from her restraints, sobbing with relief. The safe house Dmitri took me to was sterile and anonymous, the kind of place that existed only for emergencies and had no personality beyond functional furniture and reinforced doors, and I sat wrapped in a blanket that someone had draped over my shoulders even though I was not cold, watching my hands shake and trying to process everything that had happened in the space of an hour. Dmitri had disappeared to make phone calls, to coordinate with his men, to ensure that Orlov was secure and that the painting was being retrieved, and that my grandmother in Kyiv was truly safe, and when he came back, he found me in the same position, still staring at my trembling hands like they belonged to someone else. "Your grandmother is fine," he said, sitting down across from me with careful distance between us. I just spoke to the security team. She does not even know anything happened, and Jessica is being taken home. She will be fine too, shaken but unharmed. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and Dmitri leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes searching my face. The lullaby you sang to Orlov, he said quietly, it was deliberately altered. You changed the rhythm and the pauses. I could hear it because my mother used to sing similar songs, and I know how they should sound. But I need to know, do you have the real version, the actual key to decrypt the evidence? My father made me promise, I said finally, my voice coming out thin and strained. He taught me the lullaby when I was very young, made it into a game where I had to sing it differently every time, never the same way twice except when singing it to family, and I promised him I would remember, that I would keep the variations secret, and I never understood why until tonight, until Orlov explained what the lullaby really was. Family only, Dmitri repeated softly, and you were not family. I looked up at him then, at this man who was both Russian and Ukrainian, both criminal and crusader, both the person who had manipulated me into this nightmare and the person who had just saved my life. Am I now? He asked, and the question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I was not ready to examine. That depends, I said, pulling the blanket tighter around myself. Are you asking as Dmitry Volkov, the boss who manipulated me, who knew about me for 8 months before we met, who invaded my privacy and used my father's legacy as leverage? Or are you asking as the man whose mother sang the same songs mine did, who fights for justice even though it goes against his own interests, who just risked everything to save me? He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, it was in Ukrainian, his accent softening into something more genuine. I am asking as a man who wants to deserve you, he said, as someone who knows he has made mistakes but hopes to earn the right to be trusted, to be considered family, not by blood, but by choice. Then learn the words, I said, switching to Ukrainian as well. Really learn them, not as strategy or encryption or means to an end, but as memory, as culture, as the heritage your mother tried to pass on to you before she died. Teach me, he said simply, and I saw in his face something I had not seen before. Vulnerability, humility, the willingness to be a student rather than always the one in control. I began to sing, the real version this time, the lullaby my father had taught me with all its proper rhythms and pauses and variations. And Dmitri recorded it on his phone with reverent care, and later when we gave the recording to the cryptographers who could use it to decrypt the microfilm hidden in the Repin painting's frame, I felt like I was completing something my father had started, honoring a promise I had not known I was making. The evidence the microfilm contained was devastating in its scope and detail. Decades of documented crimes against Ukrainian families, orders signed by Soviet officials including Orlov Sr., records of villages starved and people disappeared, and a systematic campaign of cultural erasure that had been buried for generations. With Dmitri's resources and connections, the evidence was delivered to international courts and human rights organizations, and the resulting investigation brought down not just Viktor Orlov's network, but exposed dozens of other families who had built their wealth on blood and suffering. I watched it unfold from the safety of distance, saw Orlov's assets frozen and his business empire collapse, saw Ukrainian families receive acknowledgement and compensation for crimes committed against their grandparents and great-grandparents. And I felt something in my chest that might have been pride or grief, or both tangled together too tightly to separate. The Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg had recently opened a Ukrainian division focused on recovering and preserving Ukrainian art and cultural artifacts that had been displaced during the Soviet era. And when they reached out to offer me the position of chief restoration specialist, I thought it was another one of Dmitri's manipulations, another string pulled behind the scenes. But when I called to decline, Angry and hurt that he would try to control my career after everything we had been through, the hiring director seemed genuinely confused and sent me copies of the selection committee's notes, showed me how my published work on identifying and recovering stolen art had made me the top candidate, how my expertise in Eastern European conservation techniques was exactly what they needed. And I realized with shock that this was something I had earned on my own merit, without Dimitri's interference. My visa situation resolved itself through official channels as well, the FBI investigation having cleared me completely, and my work at the Hartley Museum giving me the documented employment history I needed for a proper renewal. And when my grandmother called to say she was moving to New York because she had been offered a spot in a senior living community that specialized in Ukrainian-speaking residents, and she wanted to be closer to me, I cried with relief and joy and the overwhelming sense that my life was finally, impossibly, coming together. I accepted the Hermitage position, but negotiated to split my time between St. Petersburg and New York. And on my last day at the Hartley Museum, before transitioning to the new role, I stood in the restoration studio where I had first heard Dmitry Volkov speak my language, where I had first felt the terrifying pull of attraction and danger, and I worked on the Repin painting that had been recovered from Orlov's attempted sale. The painting was back on my workstation, the frame carefully examined and the microfilm extracted, and I was doing the restoration work I had started months ago before everything had exploded into chaos and violence and revelation. The late afternoon light came through the windows warm and golden, nothing like the harsh fluorescent glare I remembered from that first night, and when I heard footsteps behind me, I did not turn around because I knew who it was. Had been expecting him, even though we had not spoken much in the weeks since the warehouse, both of us needing space to process what we had been through and what it meant for whatever we were becoming. "I heard you are leaving," Dmitri said, and his voice was different somehow, less certain, less controlled. "Half leaving," I corrected, still focused on the painting. "I will be back in New York regularly. My grandmother is here, my life is here, but I need to do this work, need to help recover what was stolen from my people, from our people." He moved closer and I could smell his cologne, familiar now. And when I finally looked up, I saw that he was not wearing a suit, was dressed in jeans and a sweater like a normal person, and the sight was so unexpected that I actually smiled. "You look different," I said. "I am trying to be different," he said, "or maybe trying to be more of who my mother would have wanted me to be, less about control and power, and more about," he paused, searching for words, "more about honoring the past while building something better for the future." The Repin painting between us seemed to glow in the afternoon light, the Russian artist's masterful brushwork depicting a scene of peasant life that had survived a century of turmoil to become a hiding place for evidence of crimes against the very people it portrayed. "I do not know if I can trust you," I said quietly, being honest in a way that felt dangerous but necessary. "You manipulated me, used me, knew about me for months before we met. And even though I understand why, even though I believe your intentions were ultimately good, I do not know how to build anything real on that foundation." "I know," Dmitri said, and he did not make excuses or try to justify what he had done. "I know I have to earn your trust, that I cannot demand it or expect it just because we have been through something intense together, and I am willing to do that work, to be patient, to prove myself over time rather than trying to control the outcome." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind students use, cheap and ordinary, and he held it out to me. "What is this?" I asked, taking it carefully. "I have been trying to learn Ukrainian properly," he said, "not just the phrases my mother taught me, but the language as a whole, the grammar and vocabulary, and all the things I let slip away after she died, and I thought—" He hesitated. "I thought maybe you could teach me, not as part of some plan or strategy, but just because it is your language and my mother's language, and I want to understand it the way you do, want to honor that heritage the way she would have wanted." I opened the notebook and saw pages of careful handwriting. Ukrainian words and phrases with pronunciation notes and translations, mistakes and corrections, and the evidence of genuine effort. "You have been studying," I said, surprised by how much the gesture affected me, by what it meant that he was trying to learn my language, not to use it as a tool, but to connect with something deeper. "I want to deserve you," he said again, switching to Ukrainian, though his accent was still rough around the edges. "Want to be someone you can trust. Someone who honors your father's legacy and my mother's memory. Someone who chooses justice over profit and love over control." "Love," I repeated, the word hanging between us, charged with possibility and fear. "Is that what this is?" I asked, switching to English because I needed the emotional distance the language provided, because hearing him say it in Ukrainian felt too intimate, too real. "I do not know what else to call it," Dmitri said, returning to English as well. "This feeling that you are the most important thing, that your safety and happiness matter more than any business deal or power play, that I would rather have you trust me than control you, that your voice singing in Ukrainian is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard, and I want to spend my life learning to hear it properly." I set down my restoration brush and looked at him fully, at this man who was trying to be better than his circumstances had made him, who was choosing his Ukrainian mother's legacy over his Russian father's empire, who had saved my life and my grandmother's life, and helped bring justice to thousands of families who had been waiting generations for acknowledgement. "Teach me the lullaby," he said softly, "the real version, the way your father sang it to you, not so I can use it, but so I can remember it, so I can carry it forward the way my mother would have wanted, the way your father intended." "It is only for family," I said, repeating what I had told him before, what my father had made me promise. "I know," Dmitri said, and he did not ask if he was family, did not push or manipulate or try to force the issue, just stood there waiting for me to decide, to choose, to extend trust freely, rather than having it extracted through pressure or circumstance. I thought about my father and what he would have wanted, about the legacy he had left me that was not just about evidence and justice, but about choosing who to trust with the most precious things, about building family through shared values, rather than just blood. I thought about Dmitri's mother who had protected evidence at great personal risk, who had tried to pass on her Ukrainian heritage to her son, even in a hostile environment, who had believed that some things were worth preserving even if you did not live to see them honored. I began to sing, softly at first, and then with more confidence. The lullaby in its true form, with all the variations and rhythms my father had taught me, and Dmitri listened with his eyes closed, like he was memorizing not just the melody, but the moment, the trust I was offering, the family I was choosing to build. "Nich yaka misyakna, zorista, yasnaya," I sang, and the words filled the restoration studio where we had first met, where I had first heard him speak my language, and felt the dangerous pull of recognition, of connection, of possibility. When I finished, Dmitri opened his eyes, and I saw tears on his cheeks that he made no attempt to hide, and he said in Ukrainian, "Thank you for teaching me, for trusting me with something so precious, for giving me a chance to be worthy of your father's legacy and my mother's memory." We stood there in the warm afternoon light with the Rapin painting between us, this piece of art that had hidden evidence of crimes and now stood as testimony to justice. And I understood that this was our beginning, not our ending, that we would have to choose each other every day, that trust would have to be built in small moments rather than grand gestures. Dmitri reached out slowly, giving me time to step back if I wanted, and when I did not move, he took my paint-stained hand in his and said, "I will spend as long as it takes to deserve this. To deserve you, I will learn your language and honor your culture and work every day to be someone you can trust completely, not because I am trying to control or manipulate, but because loving you means letting you choose freely, repeatedly, without pressure or obligation." "Loving me," I said, and this time the words did not feel like a question, but like the beginning of something I had been afraid to name. Something that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff and discovering I could fly. Loving you, he confirmed in Ukrainian, and then in English. And if you need time or space or distance, I will give you that too. Will wait as long as you need to decide if you can love me back. If you can trust me with your heart the way you just trusted me with your father's lullaby. I looked at our joined hands, his so much larger than mine, his expensive watch next to my paint-stained sleeve, the physical representation of everything that should have kept us apart, but somehow had brought us together. I do not know if I love you yet, I said honestly, but I know I want to find out. I know I want to try. I know that when you listen to me sing in Ukrainian, you hear something real in it, something that goes beyond strategy or manipulation, and that matters more than I want to admit. Then let us start there, Dmitri said, with honesty and patience, and the understanding that we are both trying to honor our parents' legacies by being better than our circumstances demanded, by choosing justice and truth, and eventually, maybe, love. I squeezed his hand, this small gesture of acceptance and possibility, and turned back to the Repin painting that had started everything, that had brought us together through tragedy and danger and the complicated intersection of Russian and Ukrainian history. The painting was almost fully restored now, the colors bright and true, the peasant faces looking out with dignity and strength, and I thought about all the people those faces represented, all the families who had suffered and survived and waited generations for their stories to be acknowledged. This is just the beginning, I said, both about the painting and about us, about what we were trying to build together. Just the beginning, Dmitri agreed, and he stayed with me while I worked, learning to hold brushes and mix colors and understand the patience that restoration required, learning that some things could not be controlled or rushed, but had to be carefully, slowly brought back to life through dedication and love and the willingness to honor what had come before while building something new.